So yeah, transubstantiation of poor whites. Wonder what that is. If I had my other phone, I can look this up. I got a new phone, so hey Sebastian, welcome in. So oh, we can start. My bad. Let's start, everybody. Sorry about that. I got caught up. All right, let's start. Substantiation of a poor white. How Andrew Johnson, expectedly raised to the presidency, was suddenly set between the democracy, which include poor whites and black men, and an autocracy that included big business and slave barons, and how torn between impossible allegiances, he ended in forcing a hesitant nation to choose between the increased political power of the restored Southern oligarch and votes for black people. Like nemesis of Greek tragedy, the central problem of America after the Civil War was before the black man. Those 4 million souls whom the nation had used and degraded, and on whom the South had built an oligarchy similar to the colonial imperialism of today, erected on cheap black labor or people of color, and raising raw material for manufacture. In Northern industry before the war had secured a monopoly on the raw material raised in the South for its new manufacturers. And if Northern and Western labor could have maintained their wage scale against slave competition, the North would not have touched the slave system. See what I mean? But the South had frustrated. It had threatened labor with nationwide slave competition, and had sent its cotton abroad to buy cheap manufacturers, and had resisted the protective tariff demanded by the North. It was this specific situation that had given the voice of freedom a chance to be heard. Freedom for new coming peasants who feared the competition of slave labor. Peasants from Europe, New England, and the poor white South. Freedom from all black men and white through that dream of democracy, which the best of the nation still believed. The result was war because of the moral wrong, economic disaster, and the democratic contradictions of making human labor real estate. War because the South was determined to make free white labor compete with black slaves, monopolize land and raw material in the hands of a political aristocracy, and extend the scope of that power. War because the industrial North refused to surrender its raw materials in one of its chief markets of Europe. War because white American labor, while it refused to recognize black labor as equal and human, had to fight to maintain its own humanity and ideal of equality. The result of the war left 4 million humans beings just as valuable for the production of cotton and sugar as they had been before the war. During the war, as laborers and soldiers, these black people had made it possible for the North to win without their actual and possible aid. The South would never have surrendered, and not least these 4 million free men formed in the end the only possible moral justification for an otherwise sordid and selfish orgy of murder, arson, and theft. Now, in 1865, the war is over. The North does not especially want free black people. It wants trade and wealth. See what I mean? The South does not want a particular interpretation of the Constitution. It wants cheap black labor and the political and social power based on it. Had there been no black people, there would have been no war. Had no black people survived the war, peace would have been difficult because of hatred, loss, and bitter grief. But its logical path would have been straight. the South would have retained to its place in Congress with less than its former representation because of the growing North and West. These areas of growing manufacturing and agriculture, railroad building, and corporations would have held the political power over the South until the South united with the new insurgency of the West, or the old Eastern democratic ideals. Industrialization might even have brought a third party representing labor and raised the proletariat to dominance. Of this, in 1865, there were only vague signs, and in any case, the former Southern aristocracy would not easily have allied itself with immigrant labor, while the Southern poor whites would have needed long experience and teaching. Thus, the North, in the absence of black people, would have had a vast debt, a problem of charity, distress, and relief, such reasonable amnesty as would prevent the old Southern leaders from returning immediately to power, the recognition of the reorganized states, and then work and forgetting. Quote, "Let us have peace," end quote. But there was a black man looming like a dark ghost on the horizon. He was the child of force and greed and the father of wealth and war. His labor was indispensable, and the loss of it would have cost many times the cost of the war. If black people had been silent, his very presence would have announced his plight. He was not silent. He was in unusual evidence. He was writing petitions, making speeches, parading with returned soldiers, reciting his adventures as slave and freeman. Even unintelligent, and still he must be noticed. His poverty had to be relieved, and emancipation in his case had to mean poverty. Sorry. If he had to work, he had to have land and tools. If his labor was in reality to be free labor, he had to have legal freedom of civil rights. His arrogance, ignorance, could only be removed by that very education which the law of the South had long denied him, and the customs of the North had made exceedingly difficult. Thus, civil status and legal freedom, food, clothes, and tools, access to land, and help to educate were the minimum demand of 4 million laborers. And these demands no man could ignore. Northerners and Southerners, Northerners or Southerners, abolitionists or copperheads, laborers or captains of industry. How did the nation face this paradox and dilemma? Led by Abraham Lincoln, the nation had looked back to the status before the war in order to find a path to which the new nation and the new conditions of the free men could be guided. Only one forward step President Lincoln insisted upon, and that was the real continued freedom of the emancipated slave. But the abolition democracy went beyond this because it was convinced that here was no logical stopping place, and it looked forward to civil and political rights, education, and land as the only complete guarantee of freedom in the face of a dominant South, which hoped from the first to abolish slavery only in name. In the North, a new and tremendous dictatorship of capital was arising. There was only one way to curb the direct what promised to become the greatest plutocratic government which the world had ever known. This way was first to implement public opinion by the weapon of universal suffrage, a weapon which the nation already had in part, but which had been virtually impotent in the South because of slavery, and which was at least weakened in the North. But the disenfranchisement of an unending mass of foreign-born laborers. Once universal suffrage was achieved, the next step was to use it with such intelligence and power that it would function in the interest of the mass of working men. To accomplish this end, there should have been in the country and represented in the Congress a union between the champions of universal suffrage and the rights of the freemen, together with the leaders of labor, the small landholders of the West, logically, the poor whites of the South. Against these would have been arrayed the Northern industrial oligarchy, and eventually, when they were readmitted to Congress, the representatives of the former Southern oligarchy. This union of democratic forces never took place. On the contrary, they were torn apart by artificial lines of division. The old anti-black labor rivalry between white and black workers kept the labor elements after the war from ever really uniting in the demand to increase labor power for black suffrage and black economic stability. The West was seduced from the vision of peasant proprietors, recruited from the laboring class into the vision of labor exploiting farmers and land speculation, which tended to transform the Western farmers into a petite bourgeoisie fighting not to overcome but to share spoils with the large land speculators, the monopolists of the transportation, and the financiers. Whenever the Liberal and Democratic Party started to differentiate itself from this group, the only alliance offered was the broken oligarchy of the South, with its discrimination of re-enslaving black labor. The effective combination which ensued was both curious and contradictory. The masters of industry, the financiers and monopolists, had in self-defense to join with abolition democracy, enforcing universal suffrage on the South, or submit to the reassertion of the old land slave feudalism, which increased political power. Such a situation demanded an economic guardianship of free men, and the first step to this meant at least the beginning of a dictatorship by labor. This, however, had to be but temporary union and was bound to break up before long. The break was begun by the extraordinary corruption, graft and theft that became more and more evident in the country from 1868 on as a result of the wild idea that industry and progress for the people of the United States were incapable with the selfish sequestration of profit for private individuals and powerful corporations. But those who revolted from the party of exploitation and high finance did not see allies in the dictatorship of labor in the South. Rather, they were entirely misled by the complaint of property from the Southern oligarchy. They failed to become a real party of economic reform and became a reaction of small property holders against corporation, of a petite bourgeoisie against a new economic monarchy. They immediately joined big businesses in coming to an understanding with the South in 1876, so that by the force and fraud, the South overthrew the dictatorship of the workers. But this was only the immediate cause. If there had been no widespread political corruption, North and South, there would still have risen an absolute difference between those who were trying to conduct the new Southern state governments in the interest of the mass of laborers, black and white, and those North and South who were determined to exploit labor, both in agricultural and in industry, for the benefit of the oligarchy. Such an oligarchy was, in effect, back of the military dictatorship which supported these very Southern labor governments, and which had to support them either as laborers or by developing among them a capitalist class. But as soon as there was understanding between the Southern exploiters of labor and the Northern exploiters of military support would be withdrawn, and the labor governments in spite of what they had accomplished for the education of the masses, and in spite of the movements against waste and graft, which they did inaugurated, would fail. Under such circumstances, they had to fail. And in a large sense, the immediate hope of American democracy failed with them. Let us now follow this development more in detail. In 1839, in 1863, in 1864, Abraham Lincoln had made his tentative proposal for the reconstructing the South. He had left many things unsaid. The loyal-minded, consisting of as few as 1/10 of the voters whom Lincoln proposed to regard as a state, must naturally, to survive, be supported by the United States Army until a majority of its inhabitants acquiesced in the new arrangements. It was Lincoln's found hope that this acquiescence might be swift and clear, but no one knew better than he that it might not. He was careful to say that Congress would certainly have a voice as to as to the terms on which they would recognize the newly selected senators and representatives. This proposal met the general approval of the country, but Congress saw danger in enacted the Wade-Davis bill. This did not recognize black suffrage and was not radically different from the Lincoln plan, except that the final power of assent of Congress were more prominently set forth. Lincoln did not oppose it. He simply did not want his hands permanently tied. The bill failed, leaving Lincoln making a careful study of the situation and promising another statement. He was going forward carefully, hoping for some liberal movement to show itself in the South, and delicately urging it. In the election of 1864, the country stood squarely back of him. The Northern Democracy carried only New Jersey, Delaware, and Kentucky, but he died, and Andrew Johnson took his place. Thus, suddenly, April 15th, 1865, Andrew Johnson found himself President of the United States 6 days after Lee's surrender, and a month and a half after the 38th Congress had adjourned, March 3rd. It was a clear destiny. It was a dreary destiny for the poor white South that deserted its economic class and itself. It became the instrument by which democracy in the nation was done to death. Race, I'm gonna look this word up, everybody. Provincialism. I'm gonna look it up, everybody. My bad, it's provincialism. Deified, and the world delivered the plutocracy. The man who led the way with unconscious paradox and contradictions was Andrew Johnson. Lately, the earlier life and character of Andrew Johnson have been abundantly studied. He was a fanatical hater of aristocracy. A fanatical hater of aristocracy. And this is what I think is what he says. Though through every public act of his runs, no, that's not what he says. Of his runs, one consistent, unifying thread of purpose, the advancement of the power, prosperity, and liberty of the masses at the expense of entrenched privilege. The slaveholding aristocracy he hated with a bitter, enduring hatred born of envy and ambition. If Johnson were a snake, said his rival, the well-known Isham J. Harris, he would lie in the grass to bite the heels of rich men's children. The very thought aristocrat caused him to emit venom and lashed about him in fury. His political methods were those of the barnstorming demagogue. Johnson's speeches were tissues of misstatements, misinterpretations, and insulting personalities directed to the passions and unreasoning impulses of the arrogant voters. Assaults upon aristocrats combined with vaunting of his own low origins and dignity of manual labor. Yet a biographer says that Johnson was, quote, the only president who practiced what he preached, drawing no distinction between rich and poor or high and low. But these facts furnished an explanation of Johnson's life. Do they not show why he had the courage to go up against caste and cheap aristocracy? Why he dared to stand for the underdog, whether Catholic, Hebrew, foreigner, mechanic, or child, and to cling like death to the old flag and the Union. Gladly I would lay down my life, he wrote, if I could so engraft democracy into our general government that it would be permanent. That's the end of that quote. It's just to all this, there was one great qualification. Andrew Johnson could not include black people in any conceivable democracy. He tried to, but as a poor white, steeped in the limitations, prejudice, and ambition of his own social class, he could not. And this is the key to his career. So he wanted to only help poor white people, but not black people. That's fucking great. This is another portrayal of the black laboring class in the United States. This is like one of the betrayals. The black laboring class has always and historically been betrayed by the white laboring class. Johnson sat in Congress from 1843 to 1853 and was senator from 1857 to 1862. He favored the annexation of Texas as a gateway for black immigration. He was against the high tariffs, championed free western lands for white labor, and favored the annexation of Cuba for black slave labor. McConnell introduced a homestead bill into Congress in January 1846. Johnson's bill came in March. He returned to Tennessee as governor, but induced the legislators to instruct members of Congress to vote for his bill. The bill finally passed the White House, but was defeated in the Senate, and this was repeated for several sessions. Meantime, Johnson found himself in curious company. He was linked on the one hand to the free soldiers, and in 1851 went to New York to address a land reform association. On the other hand, the South called him socialistic, and Wigfall of Texas dubbed him, quote, the vilest of Republicans, the reddest of I think they're using the R word for the color, and I don't know if it's like they're doing it to make fun of indigenous people by calling him an indigenous person. I don't know if I can say that. Lots of bad words. For 4 years past, he has been trying to please the North with his homestead and other bills. The abolitionists, meanwhile, looked askance because Johnson favored the bill for annexing Cuba. He voted against the Pacific Railroad, owned 8 slaves, and said at one time, quote, "You won't get rid of black people except by holding him in slavery." In the midst of such vacillation and contradictions, small wonder that Lane referred to Johnson, quote, triumphant ignorance and excluding unintelligence. Yet Johnson hewed doggedly to certain lines. In 1860, he was advocating his homestead bill again, and finally passed both House and Senate, but Buchanan vetoed it as unconstitutional. Johnson called the message monstrous and absurd. At last, in June 1862, after the South had withdrawn from Congress, Johnson's bill was passed and Lincoln signed it. Yet it was this same Johnson who said in the 36th Congress that if the abolitionists freed the slaves and let them loose on the South, quote, the non-slaveholders would join with the slave owners and extirpate them. Yeah. And if one should be more ready to join than another, it would be myself. Johnson early became a follower of Hilton Helper and used his figures. The impeding crisis as, quote, Andrew Johnson Vade Macum, his arsenal of facts. Johnson made 2 violent speeches against secession in 1860 to 61 with bitter personalities against Jefferson, Davis, Jahad Benjamin, and their fellows. He called them rebels and traitors. The gallery yelled and the presiding officers threatened to clear them. Johnson shouted, I would have them arrested, and if convicted within the means and scope of the Constitution by the eternal God, I would execute them. Sir, treason must be punished. Its enormity and the extent and depth of the offense must be made known. Clingman of North Carolina said that Johnson's speech brought on the Civil War. Alexander Stephens said that it solidified the North. Letters came in to congratulate and to encourage, quote, the only Union senator from the South, end quote. Labor rallied to him. In Baltimore, labor wrote that, quote, the poor working man would no doubt be called on to fight the battles of the rich, end quote. From Memphis, another wrote, quote, it was labor that achieved our independence, and the laborers are ready to maintain it. The New York Working Men's Association passed a resolution of thanks. Lincoln set about winning Tennessee, and as a step forward, it asked Andrew Johnson to go and act as military governor and restore the state. Johnson resigned from the Senate and went to Tennessee early in March 1862. He arrived in Nashville March 12 and took possession of the state house. His courage and sacrifice eventually redeemed the state and restored it to the Union. Several times Johnson spoke of slavery and the black people. When he asked that plantations be divided in the South and land open in the West, he had in mind white men who would thus become rich, or at least richer. But for black people, he had nothing of the sort in mind, except the bare possibility that if given freedom, they might continue to exist or not die out. Johnson said in January 1864 at Nashville, in reply to a question as to whether he was in favor of emancipation. Here's what he said. As for black people, I am for setting him free, but at the same time, I assert that this is a white man's government. If whites and black people can't get along together, arrangements must be made to colonize black people. In 1843, when I was candidate for governor, it was said, quote, that fellow Johnson is a demagogue, is an abolitionist, because I advocated a white basis for representation, apportioning members of Congress according to the members of qualified voters. Instead of embracing black people, they called me an abolitionist. What do we find today? Right goes forward. Truth triumphs, justice is supreme, and slavery goes down. In fact, black people are emancipated in Tennessee today, and the only remaining question for us is to settle, as Prudence, the wise man, as in assigning black people to his new relations. Now, what will that be? Black people will be thrown upon society, governed by the same laws that govern communities, and be compelled to fall back into his own resources, as all other human beings are. Political freedom means liberty to work and at the same time enjoy the products of one's labor. If he can rise by his own energies in the name of God, let him rise. In saying this, I do not argue that the black race is equal to Anglo-Saxons. If black people is better fitted for the inferior conditions of society, the laws of nature will assign him there. Oh my God. What a fucking racist little pig. Just white people. As a reward for Johnson's service and to unite the sections, Lincoln chose Johnson as his running mate in 1864. Before the campaign, June 10th, from the St. Cloud Hotel, Johnson gave his philosophy of Reconstruction. Here it is. One of the chief elements of this rebellion is the opposition of the slave aristocracy to being ruled by men who have risen from the ranks of the people. This aristocracy hated Mr. Lincoln because he was of humble origins, a rail splitter in earlier life. One of them, the private secretary of Howard Howell Cobb, said to me one day after a long conversation, quote, "We people of the South will not submit to be governed by a man who has come up from the ranks of the common people, as Abe Lincoln has," end quote. He uttered the essential feeling and spirit of the Southern Rebellion. Now it has just occurred to me, if this aristocracy is so violent, opposed to being governed by Mr. Lincoln, what in the name of consciousness will it do with Lincoln and Johnson? I am for emancipation for two reasons. First, because it is right in itself, and second, because in the emancipation of slaves, we break down the odious and dangerous aristocracy. I think that we are freeing more whites than black people in Tennessee. I want to see slavery broken up when its barriers are torn down. I want to see industrious, thrifty immigrants pouring in from all parts of the country. Come on, we need our labor, your skill, your capital. These rebel leaders have a strong personal reason for holding out to save their necks from their halter. And these leaders must feel the power of the government. Treason must be made odious, and the traitors must be punished and impoverished. Their great plantations must be seized and divided into small farms and sold to honest, industrious men. The day for protecting the land and black people in these authors of rebellion is past. It is high time. It was. During the campaign, he addressed a torchlight procession of thousands of black people and whites. He said, October 1864, who has not heard of the great estates of Cockrell, situated near this city, estates whose acres are numerous by the thousands, whose slaves were once counted by the score, and of Cockrell, their possessor and great slave owner, and of course the leading rebel who lives in the very wantonness of wealth wrung from the sweat and toil of stolen wages, and others, and who gave fabulous sums to aid Jeff Davis in overturning this government. Who has not heard of the princely estates of General W.D. Harding, who, by means of his property alone, outweighed in influence by other men in Tennessee, no matter what, where that other's worth or wisdom, sorry, it's really slow, or ability. Harding, too, early espoused the cause of treason and made it his boast that he had contributed and directly induced others to contribute millions of dollars in aid of that unholy cause. It was wrong for Cockrell and W.D. Harding, by means of forced and unpaid labor, should have monopolized so large a share of the land and wealth of Tennessee. And I say it if their immense plantations were divided up and parceled out amongst the number of free, industrious, and honest farmers, it would give more good citizens to the commonwealth, increase the wages of our mechanics, enrich the markets of our city, unleaven our all the arteries of trade, improve society, and conduce to the greatness and glory of the state. The representatives of this corrupt, and if you will permit me almost to swear a little, this damnable aristocracy taunt us with our desires to see justice done, and charge us with favoring black people equally. Of all living men, they should be the last to mouth that phrase, and even when uttered in their hearing, it should cause their cheeks to ting and burn with shame. Black equality indeed. Why? Pass any day along the side of the sidewalks of High Street, where these aristocrats must particularly dwell. These aristocrats whose sons are now in the bands of guerrillas and cutthroats who prowl and rob and murder around our cities. Pass by their dwellings, I say, and will see as many biracial and as black children, and former bearing an unmistakable resemblance of their aristocratic owners. Thank God the war has ended all this, a war that has freed more whites than black people. Suppose that black people is set free and we have less cotton. We will raise more wool, hemp, flax, and silk. It is all an idea that the world can get along without cotton. And as is suggested by my friends behind me, whether we attain perfection in the raising of cotton or not, I think we ought to simulate the cultivation of hemp, great and renewed laughter. That's what they did. For we ought to have more of it, and a far better material, a stronger fiber, with which to make a stronger rope. For not to be meticulous, maculous, and malignant, I am free to say that I believe many who were driven into this rebellion are repentant. But I say of the leaders, the instigators, the conscious, intelligent traitors, they ought to be hung. All right, that was what he said. Looking at the vast crowd of people of color, continued the governor, and reflecting through that a storm of persecution and obliquity. Oh wait, I don't know that word. I think it's oblique. Oh, I'm gonna look it up. Obliquity. They are compelled to pass. I am almost induced to wish that, as in the days of old, a Moses might arise, who should lead them safely to their promised land of freedom and happiness. You are our Moses, shouted several voices, and the exclamation was caught up and cheered until the Capitol rung again. Well then, replied the speaker, humble and unworthy as I am, if no other better shall be found, I will indeed be your Moses, and lead you through the Red Sea of war and bondage to the fairer future of liberty and peace. I speak now as one who feels the world his country, and all who love equal rights his friends. I speak to as a citizen of Tennessee. I am here on my own soil, and here I am to stay and fight this great battle of truth and justice, of a triumphant end. Rebellion and slavery shall by God's good help no longer pollute our state. Loyal men, whether white or black, shall alone control her destiny. And then this strife in which we are all engaged is past, I trust. I know we shall have a better state of things, and shall all Rejoice that honest labor reaps the fruits of its own industry, and that every man has a fair chance in the race of life. Winston interpreted that the letter apart from his speech as directed to the whites, when clearly he was speaking directly to people of color, but he was afterward unwilling to live up to its promises. As a matter of fact, he favored emancipation, quote, in order to save the Union and to free the white man, and no further. Damn black people, end quote. He once said, then charged with race equality. I am fighting those traitorous aristocrats, their masters. Johnson appeared to take the oath of office as vice president so drunk he was taken into prolonged seclusion. After the Moonlight speech, his resignation was discussed. He was not a habitual drunkard, although he drank, quote, 3 or 4 glasses of Robinson Canada whiskey some days. In 1848, Johnson writes that he had been, quote, on a kind of bust, not a big drunk. Both of Johnson's sons became drunkards and were cut off before they reached middle life. Yet Lincoln was right. Oh well, quote, oh well, don't you bother about Andy Johnson drinking. He made a big slip the other day, but I have known Andy a great many years, and he ain't no drunkard. Johnson was deeply humiliated by the inauguration episode, and perhaps here began his alienation from those who might have influenced him best. Charles A. Dana, Assistant Secretary of War, says that he met Vice President Johnson in Richmond. Here's what they said. Who's in here? I'm only letting 2 up for right now because I'm not getting a lot of coins. He took me aside and spoke with great earnestness about the necessity of not taking the Confederates back without some conditions or without some punishment. He insisted that their sins had been enormous, and that if they were yet back into the Union without any punishment, an effect would be very bad. He said they might be very dangerous in the future. The vice president talked to me in this strain of fully 20 minutes. I should think an impassioned, earnest speech on the subject of punishing rebels. His sudden induction as president was marked by modest and genuine feelings. Carl Schurz says that the inaugural speech of Andrew Johnson in 1865 was very pleasing to the liberals of the North and made them believe that he was going to allow black people to have some part in the reconstruction of the states. For months after coming to the presidency, Johnson indulged in speech making, and his words were still so severe that the anti-slavery people became uneasy, unless a feeling that Johnson would give his attention primarily to punishing the whites rather than protecting black people. April 21st, 1865, he said in an interview with some citizens of Indiana, the rebel leaders, must not only be punished, but their social power must be destroyed. And I say that after making treason odious, every Union man and the government should be remunerated out of the pockets of those who have inflicted this great suffering upon the country. This was exactly the thesis of Thaddeus Stevens' Emancipation. Thanks for all the shares. A number of Virginians visited Johnson in July and complained that they were seeking credit in the North and West, but could get no considerations while they remained under the ban of the government. The president replied, quote, "It was the wealthiest men who dragooned the people into secession. I know how this thing was done. You rich men used the press and bullied your little men to force the state into secession. He spoke as a poor white for poor whites, and the planters left in gloom. Yeah. He kept on insisting upon punishment for the South, and not only personal punishment but economic punishment, so that many conservatives were afraid that they had elected to a presidency a radical who would seriously attack the South. This would have been true, but for one thing, the Southern poor white had his attitude towards property and income seriously modified by the presence of black people. Even Abraham Lincoln was unable for a long time to conceive of free, poor black citizens as voters in the United States. The problem of black people, as he faced it, worried him, and he made repeated efforts to see if in some way they could not be sent off to Africa or to foreign lands. Johnson had no such broad outlooks. Black people to him were just black people. They used the N-word, by the way. And even as he expressed his radical ideas of helping the poor Southerners, he seldom envisaged black people as part of the poor. Lincoln came to know black people personally. He came to recognize their manhood. He praised them generously as soldiers and suggested that they be admitted to the ballot. Johnson, on the contrary, could never regard black people as men. Quote, he has all the narrowness and ignorance of a certain class of whites who have always looked upon people of color race as out of the pale of humanity. End quote. The Northern press had been quite satisfied with Lincoln's attitude. He had served liberty in America. Well, quote, Lincoln, said Senator Doolittle, representing industry in the West, would have dealt with the rebels as an indulgent father dealing with its erring children. Johnson would deal with them more like a stern and incorruptible judge. Thus, in the moment, as has the scepter of power passed from the hand of flesh to the hand of iron. At the cabinet meeting with Mr. Lincoln on the last day of his life, Friday, April 14th, Stanton submitted the draft of a plan for the restoration of governments in the South. The draft applied expressly to states, but was intended as a model for others. The president suggested a revision, and the subject was postponed until Tuesday, the 18th. Andrew Johnson became president on Sunday, April 16th. Stanton read his draft to Sumner and other gentlemen. Sumner interrupted the reading with the inquiry. Rather, any provision was made for enfranchising men of color. Says also that unless the black man is given the right to vote, his freedom is a mockery. Stanton deprecated this agitation of the subject, but Sumner insisted that the black man's right to vote was, quote, the essence, the great essential. Stanton draft, now confirmed to North Carolina, was considered in the cabinet May 9th, when it appeared with the provision for suffrage in the elections of members of the Constitutional Convention of the state. It include, quote, the loyal citizens of the United States, end quote. This paragraph, it appeared Saxton had accepted April 16th as an amendment from Sumner and Colfax. He admitted that it was intended to include black people as well as white men. Stanton invited an expression of opinion. Several members of the cabinet were absent. Stanton's denizens and Speed favored the inclusion. McCulloch, Wells, and Usher were against it. The president expressed no opinion, but Sumner was certain of the president's decision in favor of black suffrage. Sumner sought to keep close to Johnson. He and Chase had an interview with him a week after he had taken the oath of office. Johnson was reserved, but sympathetic, and they left lighthearted. A few days later, when the president and Senator Sumner were alone together, the president said, "On this question that of suffrage, there is no difference between us. You and I are alike." Sumner expressed his joy and gratitude that the president had taken his position, and that as a consequence, there would thus be no division in the Union Party. And the president replied, quote, "I mean to keep you all together." He was walking away that evening. Sumner felt that the battle of his own life was ended. He wrote to Bright, May 1st, 1865, encouragingly, I can't do that. This is a hard one to do right there. Encouragingly, "Last evening, I had a long conversation with him, Johnson, mainly on the rebel states, on how they shall be tranquilized. Of course, my theme is justice to people of color." He accepted this idea completely, and indeed went so far as to say, that there is no difference between us. You understand that the question whether rebel states shall be treated as military province or territories is simply one of form, with a view to the great result. It is the result that I aim at, and I shall never stickle on any intermediate questions. If that is secured, he deprecates haste, is unwilling that states should be participated back, thinks there must be a period of probation, but that meanwhile, all loyal people without distinction of color must be treated as citizens and must take part of any preceding form of reorganization. He doubts at present the expediency of the announcement from Washington, lest it would give a handle to party. This is hard, sorry, but it is willing to, it should be made known to the people in the rebel states. The Chief Justice started yesterday on the visit up to South Carolina, Florida, and New Orleans, and will on this way touch the necessary strings so far as he can. I anticipate much from his journey. His opinions are fixed, and he is well informed with regards to those of the president. I would not be too sanguine, but I should not be surprised if we had this great question settled before the next meeting of Congress. I mean by this that we had such expressions of opinions and acts as will forever in the case. What will forever include it. My confidence is founded in part upon the essential justice of our aims and the necessity of the case, with the president as well disposed as he shows himself, and the Chief Justice as positive, we must prevail. Will not all this sanctify our war beyond any in history? That's the question mark. And then next day, writing to Lebert, Sumner quoted Johnson as saying that, and here's what they say: people of color are to have the right to suffrage, that no states can be precipitated into the Union, that rebel states must go through a term of probation. All this he had said to me before. 10 years ago, the Chief Justice and myself visited him in the evening to speak of these things. I was charmed by his sympathy, which was entirely different from his predecessors. The Chief Justice is authorized to say whether he is what the president desires, and to do everything he can to promote organization President desires that the movement should appear to proceed from the people. This is in conformity with his general ideas. But he thinks it will disarm the party at home. I told him that while I doubt if the work would be effectively done without federal authority, I regard the modus operandi as an inferior question, and that I should be content, provided equality before the law was secured for all without distinction of color. I said during this winter that the rebel states could not come back except on the footing of the Declaration of Independence and the complete recognition of human rights. I feel more than ever confident that all this will be fulfilled. And then what a regenerated land. And what I had looked for a bitter contest on this question, but with the president on our side, it will be carried by simple, oh my gosh, avoirdupois. Hey, look at this word. It's a weird word. Avoirdupois is a system of weight. Yeah. Chase wrote Johnson from South Carolina at the same month. This is what he said. Suffrage of loyal black people. I find that readiness and even desire for it is in proportion to the loyalty of those who express opinion. Nobody dissents vehemently, while those who have suffered from rebellion and rejoice with their whole hearts in the restoration of the national authority are fast coming to the conclusion they will find their own surest, safest in the purposed extension. All seem embarrassed about first steps. I do not entertain the slightest doubt that they would all welcome some simple recommendation from yourself and would adopt readily any plan which you would suggest. I am anxious that you should have the lead in his work. It is my deliberate judgment that nothing will so strengthen you with the people or bring so much honor to your name throughout the world as some such short address as I suggested before leaving Washington, saying to the people, quote, reorganize your state governments. I will aid you in the enrollment of the loyal citizens. You will not accept me to discriminate among men equally loyal. Once enrolled, vote for delegates to the convention to reform your state constitution. I will aid you in collecting and declaring their suffrages. Your convention, and yourselves must do the rest. But you may count on the support of the national government in all things constitutionally expedient. In April and May of 1866, Tennessee had confined the right to vote to whites. Tennessee Senate refused a suffrage bill which allowed all black people and whites of illegal age to vote, but excluded after 1875 all who could not read. Sumner wanted Johnson to insist on black suffrage in Tennessee, but Johnson explained that if he were in Tennessee, he would take a stand, but that he could not in Washington. Sumner remained in Washington half through May and saw the president almost daily, always seizing opportunity to present his views on Reconstruction and insisting on suffrage for black people. Just before leaving Washington, Sumner had a final interview with the president. He found him cordial and apparently unchanged. Sumner apologized for repeating his views expressed before, Johnson said with a smile, "Have I not always listened to you?" Sumner, as he left, assured his friends and correspondents that the cause he had at heart was safe with Andrew Johnson. Disturbing signs, however, began to occur. Carl Schurz wrote in May concerning the plans of Southern leaders in Mississippi, Georgia, and North Carolina. Thaddeus Stevens was alarmed at the president's recognition of a Pierpont government in Virginia. A caucus was therefore called at the National Hotel at Washington, May 12th, to prevent the administration from going completely astray. Wade and Sumner said the president was in no danger and that he was in favor of black suffrage. Sumner may have been over sanguine and read into Johnson's words more than Johnson intended, but it is certain that Sumner received a definite understanding that President Johnson stood for real emancipation of black suffrage. Here then was Andrew Johnson in 1865, born at the bottom of society and during his early life, a radical defender of the poor, the landless, and the exploited. In the heyday of his earlier political career, he railed against land monopoly in the South, and after the Civil War, wanted the land of the monopolists divided among the peasant proprietors. Something changed then. Suddenly, by a weird magic of history, he became military dictator of a nation. He becomes the man by whom the greatest moral and economic revolution had ever took place in the United States, and perhaps in modern times was to be put into effect. He becomes the real emancipator of 4 million black slaves who have suffered more than anything that he had experienced in his earlier days. They not only have no lands, they have not owned even their bodies, nor their clothes, nor their tools. They have been exploited down to the ownership of their own families. They have been poor by law and arrogant by force. What more splendid opportunities could the champion of labor and the exploited have had to start a nation towards freedom? Johnson took over Lincoln's cabinet with an anti-abolitionist Whig, a pro-slavery Democrat, and a liberal student of industry, among others. This cabinet lasted a little over a year, when earlier in July 1866, 3 members of Denison's, Harlan, and Speed resigned, being unwilling to oppose Congress in all their logical consequence. A Reconstruction policy now associated with Johnson's name were laid down by Seward, and his logic overwhelmed Johnson. As Stevens explains, Seward entered into him, and ever since they have been running down steep places into the sea. The cabinet met at Stewart's house, May 9th. On May 29th, Johnson issued a proclamation of amnesty, which showed the Seward influence. Indeed, nothing was left, apparently, of Johnson's liberalism, except the exclusion from amnesty, not simply of the leaders of the Confederacy, but of the rich, whose worth $20,000 or more. Seward opposed this, but it was the only thing that he yielded to Johnson's liberalism. He earlier convinced Johnson that Reconstruction was a matter of the president to settle, and especially he opened the door to his thorough conversation then when the power of further pardons was put into Johnson's hands. Seward, who had remained secretary after Lincoln's death, had used all the powers of his persuasive eloquence to satisfy President Johnson that all now to be done was simply to restore the Union by at once remitting the, quote, states lately in rebellion to their full constitutional functions as regular states of the Union, and that then being encouraged by this mark of confidence, the latter master class in the South could be trusted with the recognition and protections of the emancipated slaves. That Mr. Stowart urged such advice upon the president, there is good reasons for believing. Not only was it common report, but it accorded also strikingly with Mr. Stewart's singular turn of mind concerning the slavery question. As after the outbreak of the secession movement, he preemptorily regulated the slavery question to the background, and in spite of its evident importance in the Civil War and of the influence in what it would inevitably exercise upon the opinion and attitude of foreign nations. So he may have been forgetful of the national duty of honoring to secure the rights of the freemen and the safety of the Southern Union men in his impatient desire to, quote, restore the Union in point of form. Johnson was transformed from the champion of peasant labor. He saw himself as a restorer of national unity and a benefactor of giver to those ever elements in the South which had formerly despised him. Of his real role as emancipator and the one who was to give effective freedom to black people, he still had not the slightest idea. He could not conceive of black people as men. And equally, he had no adequate idea of the industrial transformation that was going on in the North. There were, of course, the inevitable scars of the war, the loss of 1 million men and $12 billion in property, eventually pensions and indirect losses, the revolution in Southern agriculture, the universal lowering of ethical standards, which always follows war. The West was uneasy on the account of taxes, debt, and the money situation. In New York and Boston, men engaged in foreign commerce wanted speedy restoration of the South and the reduction in the tariffs to increase their businesses. These implicated threads varied and changed as time went on. But when the 39th Congress met, the war business boomed, was still on. Failures had disappeared. Prices had increased. Wealth was being concentrated among the manufacturer, merchants, financiers, and speculators. There were great amounts of waiting capital, and all of these interests wanted the war stopped and the South restored. Sumner had not left Washington 10 days before his hopes for a just Reconstruction on the basis of black suffrage were killed by President Proclamation. Johnson's plan of Reconstruction included the abolition of slavery, the repudiation of war debts, the nullification of succession ordinances, and the appointment of provisional governors to help in the reconstruction of civil government. Only those white folks who had taken the loyal oath would take part in this reconstruction. In other words, this was practically Lincoln's plan, and it was also the Wade Davis plan, save that there was no open or expressed recognition of any power or function of Congress except as judging the legality of elections. Johnson did not eventually even admit, as Lincoln apparently had agreed, that Congress was final judge as to whether these states could hold legal elections. Congress had adjourned before Lee's surrender, and it was widely believed that had Lincoln lived, a special session would have been summoned, and Stuart Johnson purposed not to call Congress. In one way, the discussion was shrewd. It gave the administration 9 months to carry out its policies, and if the policy was successful, Congress would, when it met, be faced by a facet accompli and nation of peace, a South restored with slavery abolished. What more could the nation want? On the other hand, the attempt was full of risk. Already the power of the executive had gone far beyond the dreams of living men. It must be curbed sooner or later. The military dictatorship which had carried on the war must also soon be possible after the war. The tempered of democracy, the attempt to do even what the nation wanted without this was foolish. An attempt to override the will of the nation was suicidal, and yet that was precisely what Stuart and Johnson eventually attempted. May 29th, the Declaration of Amnesty was issued, and the same month, provisional governors were appointed for North Carolina and Mississippi. In June, Georgia, Texas, Alabama, South Carolina were given governors. And in July, Florida, thus 3 months after the assassination of Lincoln, Reconstruction was in operation. The Union Party divided in opinion. The Northern Democrats encouraged the South, particularly encouraged, and the South particularly encouraged. The South thereupon turned its tension on Johnson and brought to bear the second influence next in power to the Stewards, and in the end exceeding it. Southern leaders descended upon the president, not simply the former slaves, barons, but new representatives of the poor whites. And less than 9 months after the proclamation of amnesty, 14,000 prominent persons were said to have received pardons from the president. No wonder the attitude of Johnson towards the South and the leaders of the rebellion was transformed. The very inferiority complex which made him hate the white planters concealed a secret admiration for his arrogance and address. Carl Schurz was coldly received when he returned from the Southern Strip, which Johnson had argued upon him. And it's a speech, not a speech, but alright. I arrived at Washington. I reported myself at once at the White House. President's private secretary, who seemed surprised to see me, announced me to the president, who sent out the word that he was busy. When would it please the president to receive me? The private secretary could not tell, as the president's time was much occupied with urgent business. I left the ante room, but called, it's not ante, it's ante, like A-N-T-E room, but called again the next morning. The president was still busy. I asked the private secretary to submit to the president that I had returned from a 3-month journey made at the president's personal request, that I thought it my duty respectfully to report myself back, and that I should be obliged to the president if he would let me know whether, and if so, when he would receive me to that end. The private secretary went in again and brought out the answer that the president would see me in an hour or so at the appointed time. I was admitted. The president received me without a smile and welcome. His mien was sullen. I said that I had returned from the journey which I had made in obedience to his demand, and was ready to give him, in addition to the communications I had already sent him, such further information as was in my possession. A moment's silence followed. Then he inquired about my health. I thanked him for the inquiry and hoped that the president's health was good. He said it was. Another pause, which I brought to an end by saying that I wished to supplement the letters I had written to him from the South with an elaborate report given my experience and conclusions in the connected shape. The president looked up and said that I need not go to the trouble of writing out such a general report on his account. I replied that it would be no trouble at all, but I considered it a duty. The president did not answer. The silence became awkward, and I bowed myself out. President Johnson evidently wished to suppress my testimony as to the conditions of things in the South. I resolved not to let him do so. I had consciously endeavored to see Southern conditions as they were. I had not permitted any political considerations or any preconceived opinions on my part to obscure my perceptions and discernment in the slightest degree. I had told the truth as I learned it and understood it, that with the severest accuracy, and I thought it due to the country that the truth be known. Among my friends in Washington, there were different opinions as to how the striking change in President Johnson's attitude had been brought about. Some told me that during the Sumner and the White House had been fairly besieged by Southern men and women of high social standings who had told the president that the only element of trouble in the South consisted in a lot of fanatical abolitionists who excited black people with all sorts of dangerous notions, and that all would be well if he would only restore the Southern state governments as quickly as possible, according to his own plan as laid down in his North Carolina proclamation, and that he was a great man to whom they looked up as their savior. Now, it was thought that Mr. Johnson, the plebeian, who before the war had been treated with undistinguished contempt by slaveholding aristocracy, could not withstand the subtle flattery of the same aristocracy when they flocked around him as humble supplements, cajoling him, correlating his vanity, probably grooming his, yeah. In fact, what time is it? Good. In fact, personally, Johnson liked the slaveholders. He admired their manners. He enjoyed their carriage and clothes. They were quite naturally his ideal of what a gentleman should be. He would not help being tremendously flattered when they noticed him and actually sued for his favor. As compared with Northerners, he found them free, natural, and expansive, rather than cold, formal, and hypocritical. Johnson changed his change of mind during the last 10 days of May 1865 was probably due to the flatteries of Southern leaders, to the notice taken of his intoxication in the Senate by Sumner and others, to the counsel of Preston, King, and the Blairs who sheltered him after the unfortunate exposition, and above all, to Seward. Johnson's program swung swiftly into its stride. Already, May 9th, the law of the United States had been put in operations. In Virginia and Alexandria government thus recognized Johnson recognized the Reconstruction already accomplished in Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee, so that by midsummer all the succeeding states had been reconstructed under the Johnson plan except Texas. During the autumn, summer, and winter in 1865, elections for delegates in constitutional conventions were ordered in Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida on the basis of white suffrage. Before Congress met, these conventions had all passed ordinances repealing the succession ordinance and pronouncing them null and void. All except Mississippi, South Carolina had repudiated the Confederate debt. All had amended their constitutions abolishing slavery or recognizing its disappearance. State officers and representatives in Florida had been elected. Senators had also been chosen, except in Florida. Oh my gosh, stop itching my eye. All the states and, oh my gosh. Hold on, everybody. My eye is being weird. God damn. I hate when I get a little itch in my eye, it doesn't go away. All the states had adopted the 13th Amendment except Florida and Mississippi. North Carolina had adopted the amendment with reservation. Florida adopted the amendment with reservation September 18th and elected senators. Against this suddenly marshaled and quickly executed plan of Johnson, and his advisors, there was at the time no organized opposition. Congress was unquestionably determined to have the last word in the matter, but not decided as to what the word would be. The abolitionists wanted the freedom of the slaves guaranteed, and some of them saw black suffrage as the only method to accomplishing it, while still fewer recognized that a minimum of land and capital was absolutely necessary even to make the ballot effective. The majority of Northerners simply wanted to get rid of the question as quickly as possible. They were disposed to agree in the main with Johnson, but they were afraid that he was moving too fast, and that the South was returning to the Union without guarantees, either so far as the freemen were concerned or with the regard to the problem of debt and the tariff and national finances. Charles Sumner, representing the abolition democracy, agitated the question all summer. He brought up the matter of the streets, at dinner, and in society. He wrote his view at the Atlantic Monthly and had it and his speeches distributed widely. On June 21st, 1865, there was a public meeting in Philadelphia on black suffrage, at which reports were read and reaction in the South. Sumner wrote to the members of Johnson's cabinet and urged them to change their course of action and not to follow the advice of Seward. But although 4 members of the cabinet were sympathetic, they took no action, and Sumner wrote to Lieber, Lieber, on August 11th. They were all courtiers, as if they were counselors of the king. Stevens, Davis, and Wade were in despair against the executive, who had both military power and the power of patronage, and was as yet unmoved by the unity of opinion in the North. Moreover, it did not seem wise to make as yet a fight on the basis of black suffrage. Too few Northern people agreed with it. Most public men and journalists gave no support to Sumner's demand for black suffrage. The governor of Indiana denounced it, and Governor of Massachusetts was sure of the president's honesty of purpose. The editor of the New York Evening Post advised against any coercive actions by Congress in the matter of suffrage. The New York Times stood absolutely against it. Quote, "Is there no way to arrest the wild course of the president in reorganization?" asked Stevens in the summer of 1865. "If something is not done," wrote Sumner, "the president will be crowned king before Congress meets." The abolitionists opened a campaign to convert the North to black suffrage, carrying on the propaganda with the money of industry and the logic of abolition democracy. The speech of Sumner, Kelly, Phillips, and Douglas on black suffrage were printed and sent broadcast. Stearns wrote, I am distributing 10,000 copies to anti-slavery men in all the free states, but desiring to increase the number to 100,000 or more. Invite you to aid in its circulation." He raised $50,000 and in the fall of 1865 to send out 100,000 newspapers and 50,000 pamphlets a week, and himself printed between 20,000 and 40,000 copies of Sumner's Rochester speech, October 12th, 1865. Later, the Scroots report and his newspaper article formed strong documents. I think we're going to stop there. It's 5 minutes till. Looks like President Johnson is going against it. And all these people are for what President Johnson says. They don't want black suffrage. It's kind of like, So this is just like all this fight. I'll get to that. Hold on a second. Let me mark up. This is all this fight just to seek recognition. 298. It's just all this stuff. It's just, kind of can see the roots of all these things too. It's really rooted. You can see how things are engaging now based on this knowledge, and why like black people and non-white people get disenfranchised from elections in the political process too. You know, maybe back then it was pertinent if they got the power to do that, but now there's no point in voting. Voting doesn't change anything. It keeps the system of alienation and exploitation going, no matter what. So, anyways, I don't think there's anybody coming up to talk or to give me any type of conversation. I think most people are out doing things right now. So, wow, 277 to 298, pretty good. Yeah. I don't think even Dooley's here anymore. No, Dooley is here. Interesting. I sent you a text message in Discord, Dooley, but you didn't see it. All right, everybody, I'm going to go ahead and close it off. Come back tomorrow and read some more. Might have to go back a couple paragraphs, but I really need to soak this in because it's just these people are trying to, yeah, I'm here. Yeah, no worries. They're trying, the one person seems like they're trying their hardest to bring in political power for black people to be able to engage with. But there's so many white people that are just observant, have visceral actions to it, or just play in the hands or in the face of people. You know, they still want white people to be dominant. They still want, they wanted to get rid of the South, but for their own gain. Not for the gain of what they really wanted. Because it seems like that Johnson, even becomes before that, is now being enticed into the hands of the oligarchs, the plantation owners and shit like that. So fun. We'll see what this turns out to be, because this is after Lincoln and this is during the Reconstruction period, and they're trying to just reconstruct quickly without any precedents, and like, how do we engage with the new citizens? And they're not even considering them citizens, I don't think, not yet. So yeah, anyways, all right, I'm gonna let it go. All right, everybody, have a good night.